Yes,
I'm Aaron Tomlinson.
and this is Phreology Friday, and boy, oh boy, do we have a fucking episode for you tonight. But
Yeah.
before we get into that, Aaron, what do you have in the glass? And I love this, by the way.
Yeah. I came prepared because this is going to be epic. This is going to be an epic night. I just know already. So it's a little full, but it is mango habanero whiskey, watered down with some rye whiskey. I took a page out of your book with the chocolate whiskey. So I haven't really tried the mix yet. It's a spot though.
Oh man, I can only imagine like thinking of like an old fashioned with like mango habanero whiskey.
Yeah. Oh,
That yeah, yeah,
that would be the bomb.
yeah.
That has to
That's
go on our book.
Yeah, we have to put that in the book. Coming soon, folks. We're gonna have the Phreology Friday Mixology book, and when we put it out, hopefully we'll sell enough copies of that we can finally get together and do a
Yeah,
show
exactly.
live in the same room.
Exactly.
And,
Tonight's
well,
episode's gonna be fire, man. It's gonna
it
be
is,
something.
and in the spirit of this, I'm drinking Courvoisier VSOP. I'm drinking good stuff, but
Yeah,
I'm not going light. I'm not going lightweight. This is hardcore, but it's good stuff. It's not cheap,
yeah.
But I had an interesting week. It was a combination of good and bad, but it ended on a pretty high note, and that's something that we'll talk about later. But anyway, tonight's subject is the Second Amendment and assault weapons. Now, we're going to focus more on the Second Amendment than on the assault weapons part. But there is a take on that we're going to explore and unpack. But we're going to really drill into the Second Amendment thing because for the sake of everyone that's watching, in case you haven't actually read the Second Amendment, and I'm gonna share this in the chat also. But it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And that is the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, and is part of what we call the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights basically came into being because the intent was that without the Bill of Rights, the anti-federalists felt that the reach of federal authority would be too great. And so the Bill of Rights are intended not so much to codify individual liberties as they are to check federal power, right? So that's the Second Amendment. But I'm going to focus on one part of that entire clause: a well-regulated militia. And what does that mean? I want to really drill into that. I'm not going to start into it now. I'm just saying I'm setting it up, right? That what is considered to be a well-regulated militia in the eyes of the framers of the Constitution does not exist today. Not like they envisioned it. And the other thing that I'm going to focus on, the assault weapons part, because assault weapon is a misnomer, first of all.
Hmm.
Uh, and from someone that's a liberal to socialist like me, you'll probably be surprised that I say that or that I think that, but it really is. But the whole Second Amendment was envisioned and put into place when the most common weapon was a single shot musket loading rifle. That was the prevailing weapon. And it's funny, like there were a lot of duels. The most famous in American history is that one between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, where Aaron Burr, who was the vice president of the United States, killed Alexander Hamilton. Um, And they fought with pistols. Now, pistols were considered to be a gentleman's sort of toy, but it was also considered to be inelegant and inefficient in terms of its man killing ability,
Hmm.
which is why uh, duels were considered to be sporting affairs. So, with that being said, Aaron, that's my setup, and I'm going to kick it over to you. And I know that you got a shit ton of good stuff to share about this, and I can't wait to hear it.
Yeah. So just like any other controversial issue, let me say this first. And before we dive into the weeds with this, I want to invite people to really listen to us tonight for the purpose of education. Set aside your opinions on the issue one way or the other and try not to get triggered, because here's the thing. Like, I learned so much just in the last few hours that I did not know. So I can promise you I'm going to be very passionate, because if there's one thing I'm passionate about, it's being ignorantly beholden to something that you do not fully understand. And I'm not claiming I fully understand it. I don't know what I don't know. I'm not a
Yep.
constitutional, I'm not even a lawyer, right? So, but there is so much misuse of the Second Amendment. People don't understand it. So, if nothing else tonight, everybody, this is going to be educational for you, I think. Definitely was for me. And then the other thing, Derrick, this whole issue feels remotely familiar. It feels like a religious issue. I feel like I'm back in Christianity, where it like you've got the sacred text, the
Mm-hmm.
Bible.
Yep.
Then you have the interpretation, the hermeneutics of the sacred text,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And then you have commentary on the sacred text based on the hermeneutics, and then you have camps.
Right.
And just like in religion, in every camp, the average zealot, like the average, radical Jesus person sitting in your church, Pentecostal, doesn't know what they don't know, and they think their way is right and God ordained and all this stuff. And this is the same thing.
But can I sling something in there real quick?
Sure.
Because it's funny that you mentioned that in the framework of sacred text, because you cannot divorce the Second Amendment from the moral majority and the Christian right in America. These two are inextricably they're what is that word? Inextricably
Inextricable.
linked.
No, I can't say it.
I can't say it either. And I've only had like a couple of sips of cognac.
Yeah,
Fuck.
me too.
But they're linked in such a way that they can't be separated. It's almost like when we talk about like light and shadow, right? And people will try to focus on the light and ignore the shadow, but the two are linked. They cannot be separated. You can't have light without shadow, and you can't have shadow without light. So likewise, with this whole Second Amendment thing, the gun lobby and the Christian right are they are hardcore bedfellows.
Hmm.
But anyway, that's
Well,
that's what I had to throw in there.
well, it's the same system. So here, what we like as human beings is we like simple, and we like black and white, and we like for it just to be so plain. But here's the other thing that I noticed as I was listening to both sides of the issue.
Yep.
YouTube videos put out by lawyers that are, hardcore conservative gun rights people, and then, people on the other side. This is the thing I noticed. They act like it's so black and white and so simple, and like there's no nuance to it whatsoever. Like there's no context to it whatsoever. Like there's no history behind it whatsoever. It's almost as though they're saying the Second Amendment plainly says, the Bible clearly says,
It really says.
and then they break it down to the most simple, basic level of thinking that is black and white. And so I want to challenge our audience to let us get into the weeds on this thing. Let us nuance this for you. And because this is a life or death matter, we're having multiple shootings a day in this country. Last I checked, which was a few days ago, 139 something mass shootings in America just this year alone.
Yep.
And I'm sure it's gone up since then. I think that was before the last couple of shootings.
Yeah, I think it's 143 was the number that I heard this week.
Yeah, so this is a life or death issue. So you can take the time to put in some mental labor. So I'm going to ask you to put your thinking caps on with us and go down this rabbit hole with us. And I think you will be enriched and benefited from watching this episode. So that's my intro.
And this is my thing. When it says a well-regulated militia, first things first. When the United States was founded, there were two basic camps. You had the Federalist camp that were in favor of a strong central government, and you had the Anti-Federalists that were more in favor of, dare I say it, a confederacy, right?
Mhm.
And so in order to forge this constitution, forge this nation, forge this identity, there were a lot of compromises that had to be made. Slavery was one of them.
Mhm.
The bicameral legislature was another. The presidency, the judiciary, all of these things were taken into effect. And one of the biggest things were what they didn't want was how European nations had standing armies at the behest of kings.
Yep.
And so the newly minted United States decided that having a standing army was a bad idea. And this was
Say that
something.
again. Wait. Say that for the people in the back.
Yeah, I mean
Say that again.
the newly minted United States thought a standing military was a bad idea, and here's the thing: if we fast forward to
Bad idea.
Dwight D. Eisenhower's exit speech from the presidency, he said something to the effect of "Beware the military-industrial complex." In other words, Eisenhower understood the power of military, and as a one of the few five-star generals that this nation has had, he understood this. He understood it in the military sense, but he also understood in the political sense and in the economic sense. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. But going back to the founding of the founding of this nation and the framing of the Constitution, it was thought that having a standing army was a bad idea. So what they said was that the individual states would remain independent in the fact that they would have their own local militias at the behest of the governor of each state that would in turn, they would raise up these militias in the event a military action was needed. And this is another thing. These militias were also not, they weren't just intended to protect the states against the federal government. They were intended to protect themselves from each other so that Ohio could not be invaded by, well, Ohio wasn't a state then, so that Pennsylvania could not be invaded by New Jersey.
Mhm.
Okay. So these are some of the things. And this militia only made sense when there was no standing army, which changed after the War of 1812, when at that point Congress issued an edict that was signed into law by the president that gave the ability to raise standing armies and navies.
Mhm.
And once that happened, and again, a provision was put into this that gave the states the right to raise their own national guards, or again, an expansion of the term the local militia, to defend the state, right? And also the concept of the president of the United States being the commander in chief of the army or the military is something that was derived from the states, because the governor was the commander in chief of the militia, but the United States at its inception did not have a standing military, so the president was commander in chief over nothing. So now we have National Guard, we have standing military, And all of these things are there ostensibly for the protection of the population.
Mm-hmm.
But when we go to look at the Second Amendment, and I said I was going to share this. Let me put this up here, and I'll show it. I'm going to put it on the screen because this is what everybody needs to see. The well-regulated militia part, and then the second clause, which is being necessary to the security of a free state. This meant, number one, the individual states. That the individual states could be free from federal tyranny and they could be free from incursion by other states. So that no state would come in and try to take over another state. And this was once standing armies were made available, and national guards or the state militias were transformed into national guards. That these are the bodies that protected both the local and the federal level from external threats. And there is no longer a need for a local militia. But let me go back to the first clause for a second. Well regulated. Well regulated. In other words, well regulated says it meets frequently, that there is a common set of rules, a common discipline, and a very strict and narrow sense of where they would be engaged. That's the regulated part. Now, I posted something on Facebook today because I saw this and it blew my mind. It said a well-regulated militia doesn't go around killing school children. When this law is being used to usurp the rights of someone else, because see, if you go back to the preamble of the Constitution, it says life, liberty, and property. That's what this country is built on. Now, what that means is that my rights end where your rights begin, and you cannot sacrifice children on the altar of your right to have a fucking gun.
I'm chomping at the bit.
No, dude, go ahead, jump right in.
Yeah. So John Locke said that people are given, the philosopher John Locke, which Jefferson heavily leaned on when he was authoring the Declaration of Independence. And he quotes almost verbatim a statement from John Locke, who says, he kind of put forth this idea that all men were created equal, this John Locke, and have the right to life, liberty, and property. Right. And then he goes on to expand on the idea of property to not only include your home and your belongings, but also self-possession, self-regulation, self-sovereignty to pursue your own well-being. So Jefferson changes the quote from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well, that's in the Declaration, but in the Constitution, it's life, liberty, and property. They changed it.
Yeah, they go back to John Locke. Yeah. So, but I wanted to jump in because I want to give some context to this. Like, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the founding of this nation did not happen in a vacuum, and these guys weren't, saying anything that was strange or other than what were popular ideas of the time. So if you want to know where some of the language and history for the language of the Second Amendment comes from, let me just pull it up here so I get the right date. It goes all the way back to 1689, and it's a religious issue.
Here we go.
It is a religious issue because in England, in the late 1600s, Protestants were being denied the right to bear arms. And okay, let me slow down. The whole idea of democracy is a pushback or a break, a departure from this whole idea of the divine right of kings. So what was happening in 1689 is that Protestant white property owners, this is why I'm bringing up the property and emphasizing it, white Protestant property owners, specifically the barons, so we're talking aristocrats,
Yep.
were disarmed by the king because he was claiming divine right of kings.
Yep.
And so the whole issue was not about everyone having a right, and this gets at the bedrock
Oh, man.
of the founding of our nation. It's not about every person having rights. It's about, and this is just, we have the receipts. Like, I'm not trying to be anti-American. I'm not trying to be anything like this, but we have the receipts that the people who have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness were the people who had the right to life, liberty, and property. That's why I'm emphasizing this point, Derrick, because literally what they were doing was protecting the rights of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The people, as it's used in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, is, and this is recognized in court precedents, Supreme Court writings. Like I said, we have the receipts. The people that these rights belong to is not like we use the word people today. It's not universal, anybody who's breathing and has an anatomy like ours. It specifically refers to, now watch this, those who participate in the politic or the political group, or those that have the rights to participate in how it was governed. And because we're coming out of aristocracy in 1776, women were property, slaves were property, and commoners, or people who were in a poor class, did not have the right to participate in, they didn't have the right to vote, to make it simple for people. So the only thing the founding fathers were protecting were those that had the right to vote, and the only ones that had the right to vote were white men with property.
Right.
So we've completely shifted it to make it say something that it was not intended to say in the original.
Right.
And so, yeah, anyway, so that's the historical.
Keep going. You're on a roll.
That's the historical context for it. And so, and you're absolutely right on the issue of militia. And let me see if I've got it here. I think I copied some quotes here. So when they're debating the Second Amendment, we have all that stuff in writing. We have the Federalist Papers. We have the Anti-Federalists. They're submitting their stuff in writing for consideration on how the Constitution is to be framed, how the Bill of Rights is to be framed. And the foundation for the Bill of Rights, by the way, goes back to natural law. There's some people, God bless them, they call it common law, and they're confused. They don't know the difference between British common law and John Locke's concept of natural law. But at the end of the day, so John Locke's making this argument that all people have this divinity within them, but not all people. You got to understand that, not all people. And this is why I have trouble with some of the conspiracy theories that are out there being promoted by people, because they don't understand it's rooted in white nationalism. Absolutely. It goes all the way back to this idea of aristocracy, and that then especially, and I'm as wasp as they come. I'm absolutely as wasp as they come. And I got to tell you that the Brits, and I've talked with my British friends, this is something ingrained in the culture. They believed that they were superior way before the Nazis and the Aryans and stuff like that. They were gifted by God with a divine spark, and black people specifically, but any person of color of any race, was not deemed as highly evolved and therefore did not have the divine spark. Therefore, their rights were alienable.
Yeah.
And now we're trying to revive that by people saying, "Oh, we need to go back and just follow British common, or not British common law, but British natural law," and they don't realize they're embracing a philosophy of white supremacy. So that's the first thing
Yep.
I want to get
Yep.
off my chest.
Keep on, man, because you're killing it.
That's the first thing I want to get, and that's why. So here's some of the precedents that the Supreme Court set regarding the right to bear arms had a lot to do with whether or not slaves could bear arms after the Civil War, right?
Right.
And so here's the ironic thing. The Supreme Court argues the well-regulated militia part to say that slaves essentially didn't have the right to bear arms.
Because they didn't have the ability to self-regulate.
Exactly, because they weren't, and this is in the exchange going back and forth too, because ironically, believe it or not, Thomas Jefferson put some, I don't know the specifics of it, but apparently he put some strong language in was it Jefferson? Yeah, I think it was Jefferson. Yeah. He put some strong language and was pushing back against slavery, even though he owned slaves, ironically, even though he owned slaves. And the states came back, the southern states came back and said they're not fully evolved humans. And they were kind of relying on the way Great Britain had interpreted the right to bear arms and stuff like that. But here's the other thing, to come back to well-regulated militia, and I'll kick it back to you. This thing that happened in England in 1689, their issue was that during times of peace, and this is what it says in the English Bill of Rights. So there's an English Bill of Rights that precedes the American Bill of Rights, upon which the founding fathers were using as their template, right? And the language there, their thing was that during times of peace, that the king should not have a standing military.
Right.
And so this whole idea of a militia, this whole framing, like you said, Derrick, but I just want people to really understand this whole framing of the Second Amendment was to protect states from the tyranny of a standing military that was run by a commander-in-chief. We've gone exactly back to the very thing that the founding fathers were afraid was going to happen. And nobody realizes it because we didn't get taught, or we forgot about it, or this stuff it's just not out there. We want these black and white arguments, and we want to say, okay, it's, we have the right to bear arms, and really go buy a tank, go buy a missile.
I mean, you can't even buy a machine gun, a fully automatic weapon, without a Class 3 federal firearms license. So there are restrictions. There are things that constrain that. Now, here's the big question, right? What kind of weapon does anyone need? I mean, honestly, for home defense, I can tell you some things like for example, I always say this. I put this out here like this, right? That I own somewhere between 1 and 1,000 guns. And I own somewhere between 1 and 1 million rounds of ammunition. Play at your own risk, right? Mm-hmm. But I understand some things about firearms. Like, for example, if I fire a 223 AR-15 style rifle in my house and I aim at an intruder and I miss, that bullet doesn't just stop at the first wall it hits. That bullet has the velocity and the density to penetrate drywall, wood, and even masonry. So theoretically, now I live far enough from my neighbors where it's probably not an issue, but like where we lived in Arizona, where we were like very close to our neighbors, if I fired an AR-15 inside my house, there is a good chance that I could kill a neighbor.
Yeah.
Without intending to do it. So people say, well, okay, I need to have a weapon to defend my household. Okay, simple, pump shotgun. 12 gauge. That's probably all you need. Maybe even 20 gauge. Smaller gauge shot. That's really all you need. You don't need an AR-15. You don't need a Glock 17. You don't need anything that has the capacity to hold 100, or even 30 or 40 rounds of ammunition. That's the thing. And again, well regulated. Let's go back to well regulated. In the military, they have specific gun types for specific applications. For
Hmm.
example, there is a type of weapon that Marines and soldiers use in infantry. But there are also weapons that SEALs, Deltas, and Green Berets
Hmm.
use. There are pistols that are used by the rank and file military, and then there are pistols that are authorized for use by special forces. And the ones that are authorized for use in special forces, they tend to have more capacity, they tend to have better machining and things like that, so that they can fire under wet conditions or muddy conditions, that they can that they have precisely machine feed ramps and receivers so that it can fire any kind of ammunition. So it doesn't matter whether you have good ammunition in the field or junk ammunition, you can still get the job done. Okay, so in terms of household, let me expand this out a little bit. Let me nuance this a little bit more, because it's now, for the first time in the history of the United States, we have concealed carry in without permit in more states than we don't. 27 states now have concealed carry with, you don't have to have training, you don't have to have any kind of permits, you don't have to do background checks or anything. If you have a gun and ostensibly you're a law-abiding citizen, you can carry concealed. Well, what does this mean, right? It used to be that in the good old days, people didn't cap off. They didn't develop diarrhea of the mouth because they might get a fist-sized suppository in it. In other words, people knew when to shut the fuck up.
Hmm.
But now, with everybody being able to carry a firearm, now
Hmm.
you really have to temper what you say, because what used to be, you just kind of take five across their lips, like Fred Sanford would say, to where you could be planted dead, and all of this, it's like, okay, what part of this is well regulated? I mean, it's
Well,
like people are focusing on the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but
exactly what I was going to say.
that people focus on that part, that clause of the amendment, while ignoring the first two. And if you do that, right, what you're saying is, like, to your point, Aaron, you are taking all of the nuance out of this, and you're making this a black and white issue when it really isn't. Everybody doesn't need a gun. You know, I'll tell you a story. My grandfather never had a driver's license. Never. He had driven a car before and he crashed it. Now, I've heard different stories about what happened in the crash and all that. I'm not going to get into that. But what I am going to say is that my grandfather had the sense of presence, because he used to like to drink too. He had the sense of presence to know that I don't really need any part of a car.
Hmm.
Now, that to me is a certain level of introspection that most people lack.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, if you know you have a bad temper, if you know that you're quick to respond without thinking, if you know that you're given over to violence, if you know these things about you, because to thine own self be true, you know this. you know you don't need a gun,
Hmm.
you know? And it's funny, like I'm gonna speak about me, so I don't offend anyone else. Because I'm a guy that used to have a bad temper, you know? And so when we were living in Arizona, first of all, let me go back to Texas, because in Texas I had a concealed carry permit. In Arizona, you didn't have to have that, right? So half the time when we left the house, I was packing. Now, one time I was packing and my wife found out that I was packing and she said, you really don't need to have a gun out in public. And I was like, you know, you're right.
Hmm.
I probably shouldn't. Because even though I think I've been quote unquote delivered from some stuff, I, I know me.
Hmm.
So I don't think, so as a result, I rarely ever conceal carry anymore.
Hmm.
But most people don't have that level of introspection. But you need to have that. You need to understand what your level of response to a threat is.
Yeah. How well
And
regulated you are.
yeah, and that's it. Well regulated. That's when you talk about well regulated, start at ground zero. Self regulation. Self regulation. Second thing is community regulation. In other words, am I going to get caught up in some mob mentality shit? Right? And then the third level is governmental regulation. Am I authorized by the government, codified by the government to have this weapon? And understanding that self-regulation, community regulation, government regulation, that all of these things I need to be under control. And I need to understand the scenarios in which I may use this. There is no scenario. There is no justification. There is no reason for anyone to take a weapon into a highly populated area and use it.
Hmm.
And let me just say this too, because our man Ted Cruz came out and he said something that didn't age well at all. He said, well, we need to have our schools more like banks. We have our banks are well armed or they're protected with a good guy with a gun so that nobody dies
Hmm.
and our money is protected.
Right.
Well, this guy goes into the bank in what was that was
Yeah, I
that
can't remember,
Knoxville?
but
Knoxville, right?
I
No,
don't
no, no,
remember.
no, no, no. Louisville, Kentucky. I'm picking on Tennessee for some reason. But goes into a Louisville bank and he kills 5 people. There is no justification for that. And the funny thing is that I thought it was funny, and this is where I'm going to kick it back to you, because when this person, this individual, went in and killed people in this private school, which, by the way, they had armed security at this school, and because it was a conservative private school, there were armed teachers there. Didn't help one bit. Didn't help. Didn't
Yeah.
help. But they were trying to frame it as that, well, this is just some disgruntled transgender person, and this is why they did this. But then in Louisville, this is your average cis white male, frustrated because he got fired, and he goes out and he kills a bunch of people. And what I'm saying is that there is no circumstance, and what I'm waiting for the gun nuts, I'm waiting for the gun humpers to come out and say, well, this was justified, or that there was some nuance. There are areas, Aaron, where there's nuance. And as we're talking about this amendment, there are a lot of nuance, a lot of areas for nuance. But when you go in, you take a weapon into a highly populated area, uh, you know, Columbine, Sandy Hook, Las Vegas, right? There is no justification for this.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's
Well, the problem is we're trying to solve 21st century problems with 18th century logic, or in other words, the founding fathers had a certain concerns and problems that they were trying to solve that were dependent upon their historical context.
yep,
And we have a completely different historical context, and we're trying to solve it. But the other problem is, and we keep harping on this, but like, have people never read the Second Amendment? Like, because this whole thing about a well-regulated militia, they could foresee that was a necessary, that the well-regulated part was a
yep,
necessary thing to do. And we've just thrown that completely out the window. And we focused strictly on the right to keep and bear arms. So you can keep a gun in your home and you can bear it on when you're out in public, right? And
yep,
so we've gone to this far extreme to where we interpret the Second Amendment to say anybody can have and carry a weapon, without realizing that the way the English language worked back then, the prefatory clause, which is the first part, a well-regulated militia, gives context in
right.
which the next
Thank you.
part happens. So the right to keep and bear arms is in the context of a well-regulated militia in order to guarantee a free state.
Right.
And we've thrown that out. So then you have to ask yourself, okay, how did that happen? Now, this is an interesting thing, right? So if anybody wants to educate themselves on this, there was a case, and I'm going to get in the weeds with this, maybe a little too much, but I think it's important. Again, put your thinking caps on here. There was a case in 2008, the District of Columbia versus a guy named Heller. It was DC v. Heller.
Mm-hmm.
And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found in favor of Heller 5-4. And it was on this issue. The District of Columbia had passed a law saying that you could not own a handgun or any kind of firearm in the District of Columbia. And Heller was a former police officer, and he was well trained, and he wanted to be able to carry, keep a firearm on his person. And this goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and they decide 5-4 in favor of Heller. And in doing so, they throw out 200 years of precedent, and they completely reinterpret the Second Amendment to mean something that it doesn't mean. But this is the fascinating thing. This didn't happen until 2008. Now, when I was educating myself on this, I saw a video from a lawyer, an attorney, who was clearly a gun nut. Like, what'd you call him, a gun humper?
Yeah.
And and this is where I was like, oh, this is so much like religion. He says, okay, all of y'all, out there that you're talking about, and this is what people on the left always do. They always bring up the well-regulated militia part. And I'm going to settle this once and for all in my 5-minute video, and I'm not even going to give you my opinion. I'm going to quote the Supreme Court. And basically, well-regulated militia, they just throw out the context. They basically say the causal clause, which is the second part, is it, and this context clause, this prefatory clause, which gives a context, that doesn't mean anything. So they're focusing on content without context, and they completely just mark it out. And then he says, and this is what the Supreme Court said. And in essence, Derrick, he's right. But what they don't tell you, what he doesn't tell you, is that it was split. The decision was split 5-4. And the person who wrote the dissenting opinion was Justice Stevens, who was appointed by Gerald Ford, I think, in 1977. And he was a conservative justice.
That's correct.
And the other thing he doesn't tell you is that there were 4 cases previous to that had been heard by the U.S. Supreme Court that were decided upon the prefatory clause. They found in each case in favor of the states or the federal government, using the argument that the Second Amendment only applied to a well-regulated militia. And so I went and read the dissenting opinion. And I got to tell you, when you read Scalia wrote the opinion on it. You can go to the U.S. Supreme Court website and you can read the things. When Scalia drafts the opinion, he's parsing words. He goes back to dictionaries from 1771 and whatever, and he defines every single word in there, right? And then he kind of does this sort of, in my opinion, what I used to watch people do with the Bible, this sort of gymnastic move, mental gymnastics, to make it say what he wants it to say, right? And so how did this come about? Well, in maybe he wasn't, Stevens wasn't put on the bench in 1977. I'm probably getting my dates wrong. Maybe I'm not, but the NRA in 1977 shifted their position from being an organization that was mostly about hunting,
safety, and marksmanship,
conservation, and marksmanship, to the right of every person to carry a gun, which is, I have to believe, I haven't done my homework on this, but I have to believe somewhere in there, these gun manufacturing companies are trying to sell their stuff, right?
Yep.
So now you have this big push. They're the ones that put in people's minds.
But wait a second, Aaron, 1977. What's special about 1977? This is the advent of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority.
Yeah.
In other words, what I was saying about how these two are linked, and I'm going to say this and I'll shut up, is that basically when these two, basically what the moral majority was saying is that everything that they held dear about things that they think made America great, that these are the things that we need to build a platform around. And that we need to also, what, Aaron, take the nuance out, right? And make this a black and white issue, because the more black and white you can make it, the more nuance you can remove from it, the more polarizing issues become. And the more you force people into taking a stand on some particular position or the other, even though they may not completely agree with either extreme. And then this goes back to what we were talking about last week about the Overton window, right? If we can make this extreme position such that we get enough people to camp with this, then we move the needle.
Well, so here's the neuroscience of this too, right? So it becomes an emotional issue, and that's why these things are hard to talk about, because people are thinking with their emotional brain and they're not thinking in a nuanced way with the logical brain. And so if we make it black and white, we make it super simple. Everybody has the right to bear a gun. And if you infringe on anybody's right to bear a gun or carry any kind of gun at all, to own it and carry it and take it anywhere, then you are violating their Second Amendment. That's really...
Oh, no. It's not just violating the Second Amendment. It's like saying, if you violate this, there was a video that we were watching earlier that called the Second Amendment the preeminent among equals in terms of all the amendments. Nobody talks about the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment. Nobody talks about those, right? The Eighth, the Ninth, the 10th Amendment. Nobody talks about those. But the Second Amendment gets there's a lot of heavy lifting. And the idea is that what conservatives will tell you is that if I can take away your right to bear arms, to keep and bear arms, I can take away any liberty you have. And that's the scare tactic.
But here's why it works. Because when you're talking about self-defense, you're talking about a very basic evolutionary need for survival. I don't think maybe the part about cruel and unusual punishment maybe comes the closest, but it's the one thing in the Bill of Rights that speaks to the emotional brain, that speaks to what some people call the reptilian brain, which is actually what we call the limbic brain. It's the emotional brain. And when the emotional brain is really firing, the neocortex, where all of this higher level thinking stuff comes from, it completely shuts down. All the energy is going to the emotional brain. So most people are responding to this Second Amendment issue out of their emotions because it's connected to this issue of survival, and they're not thinking it through. So if we make it extremely black and white, we make it extremely emotional, what we do then is we dumb down the we dumb down the electorate, and we shut down their ability to challenge us with any kind of critical or analytical thinking, because now they're just responding out of their limbic system. They're just responding out of their emotional brain, their evolutionary brain. They're responding from a place of survival. So they're not thinking. So that makes it easier for us to manipulate them and to control them. And so the only answer for us, the only hope for us really, is to be able to have nuanced discussions about these types of things. But let me read you some stuff. I got one quote in here from Stevens that I want to highlight if I can find it. Oh, darn it. Let's see. Yeah, this is great stuff right here. He says the Second Amendment was adopted to protect the right of the people of each of the several states to maintain a well-regulated militia. It was a response to concerns raised during the ratification of the Constitution that the power of Congress to disarm the state militias and create a national standing army posed an intolerable threat to the sovereignty of the several states. Now listen to this language. He's talking about the Supreme Court here. We ourselves affirmed it in 1980. See Lewis v. United States, U.S., or anyway, he gives the case number. Now listen to this. He says, no new evidence has surfaced since 1980. He's quoting, no new evidence has surfaced since 1980 supporting the view that the amendment was intended to curtail the power of Congress to regulate civilian use or misuse of weapons. The opinion of the court announces today, the opinion the court announces today fails to identify any new evidence supporting the view that the amendment was intended to limit the power of Congress to regulate civilian uses of weapons. So basically what he says is, he says some of the very same justices that sat on this court, and I have to believe he's probably picking on Scalia,
Yep,
wrote in a previous precedent that there has been no new evidence that will move us away from a well-regulated militia. And now all of a sudden you are introducing this idea by parsing words that doesn't matter because you can't find any new evidence. So basically he's calling them out and saying, you're totally contradicting yourselves. You said this in 1980 and you're saying this now in 2008, and you don't support it with any new evidence that would cause the courts to change their mind. And then he goes on to talk about, in very eloquent terms, that the purpose of the courts is to interpret the law, not to create new laws. To interpret the law, not to create new laws from the bench. And he basically, in a very sophisticated way, says the conservatives have been accusing the liberals of using the courts to push forward their agenda. And you're doing the very same thing with this ruling that the court gives today. And so this is what's so shocking to me. This happened in 2008. After Columbine, after how many mass shootings, and at that point, and this is why I think at the end of the day, I think money and corruption has to be behind this, and it's crazy, Derrick. It's crazy. We have to come to the table as Americans, and we have to sit down and say, look, we don't have the musket rifles anymore. We don't have militias anymore. We have mass shooting on a massive scale. We have children dying practically every month now with
Yep.
school shootings.
Yep.
And all you motherfuckers are doing is hiding behind your Second Amendment because you know your fucking electorate has never even read the Second Amendment, much less any of the Federalist Papers or anything that came in to give context to the federal to the Second Amendment. And you're irresponsibly and knowingly culpable, and you are taking advantage of people's lack of emotional intelligence, lack of having connection to their reasoning parts of their brain, and our children are being murdered. So fuck you guys. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to come back to having rational discussions and say, look, we're not trying to solve a problem of a federal government that is going to take over the states, because that's already happened.
Yep.
Everything that's in the Constitution that they were trying to defend against has already taken place.
Yep.
It's already happened. You know, Frankenstein's monster has gotten out of the lab. And so we can't apply that to this. We have to come up with different answers to the problems that we're facing today. And the problems that we have today is that the federal government, by using money, by threatening states to take away federal funding, has now become the Frankenstein's monster that the founding fathers were trying to protect against when they created the monster to begin with.
Yep.
And so we have to be able to sit down and say, okay, we've got to have some common sense legislation. But how do you do that when, you know, Mitt Romney received over his career 13 point something million dollars in donations from gun manufacturing companies alone? And I don't know what the answer is. I'll be honest. I don't know what the answer is, because I mean, can you imagine a scenario where we say, okay, the government is going to come in and disarm you of your assault rifles, of your AR-15s and these kinds of things? They're already out there. They're already in circulation. Dude, Frankenstein's monster has gotten out of the lab, and us and our future generations are the ones that have to deal with the carnage. All right.
You know,
sorry, I got passionate. I've had too much whiskey.
No. The whole Tennessee thing, you know, that whole thing. Smith & Wesson, the gun manufacturer, recently announced that they're moving their headquarters from Springfield, Massachusetts to Knoxville, Tennessee. And that's big. Smith & Wesson is a big company. And you have to think that the Tennessee legislature is afraid of saying anything that might upset that apple cart, because that represents money. And because the Republicans are also supporting this, it also represents power to them. Now, I want to take a minute and redirect the conversation just for a minute to the AR-15.
Yeah.
Right? Now, full disclosure, I own at least 3 of them. At least. And I happen to think that they're good weapons. You know, I've used them in the military, a derivative of them, not necessarily that one.
Sure.
But I know that you can absolutely submerge one of these guys, and as long as you got pretty good, you know, well-sealed ammo, you're going to come up out of the water firing. It's a beautiful thing. You know, and you could fire reloads in them and all kinds of stuff, and they just work.
Mm-hmm.
And people call them assault weapons. Well, they're not. There's no such thing as an assault weapon.
Right.
This is where like I said, where all of my socialist and liberal friends are going to get mad at me, because there's no such thing as an assault weapon. What
Yeah,
there
yeah,
are,
but people on the left need to know this stuff because you have to speak accurately and intelligently if you're
that
going
you
to move
do,
the needle.
you absolutely do.
So if they get
And
mad at you, they're just in their limbic brain again. I mean, it's sorry, I didn't
no,
mean to cut you off.
but you're right. This is the same conversation that you and I have with the love and light community.
Mhm.
You know, because you go off on this tangent and you abandon reason, and when you abandon reason, you're no different than the Christians that you're butting heads against. So you have to come back. You have to bring this back to logic and reason, and it's this: the AR-15 is a weapons platform that is designed to, depending on the type of receiver that you use, it could fire a number of different kinds of ammunition. We were talking before we came on, for everything from 22 long rifle, 22 Magnum, all the way up to 7.62 NATO rounds. Okay, and and everything in between. 223. When you get to like 223 and higher, now you're talking about man killers, right? And these rounds of ammunition are designed specifically for the damage that they inflict upon human anatomy. But there, I have a friend that has an AR-15 shotgun.
Mm.
It's a 20
Wow.
caliber shotgun that can hold. It has a 20 round magazine
Dude.
with 20, you could shoot 20 gauge double aught buck in this thing at the rate that you could fire an AR-15, to the point where like the recoil is pretty severe on those, because I remember when I fired this gun, my shoulder was bruised for a month.
I bet. I
You
bet.
know,
I can't even imagine.
so the thing is that this is a successful platform that is highly adaptable, right? And it has to be highly adaptable because its original use was military. And so in the military, you have to be able to adapt and improvise, right? Quoting Gunny Highway from Hamburger Hill, right? Clint
Yeah.
Eastwood,
Right, right, right,
right?
right. Right.
You got to adapt and improvise. Okay, so that's the thing about the AR-15. It is it as a weapons platform in and of itself. It is no more dangerous than any other weapons platform, other than the fact that part of its adaptability means you can cycle more rounds through it. You can fit a larger magazine
Right.
to it. And those are the things that make it deadly, because if you have let's say a 50 shot banana magazine, or a 200 shot barrel magazine, this basically expands your killing portfolio,
Yep.
your killing envelope, and that's the problem. So watch this.
Right.
I think it was in 1994 that President Clinton enacted what they call the assault weapons ban, and they banned high capacity magazines. They banned platforms that had that you could change the receivers and all of that. So the AR-15 was essentially banned during this period. So from 1994 until 2000, mass shootings went down dramatically, with the exception of
Right.
Columbine, which Columbine had multiple shooters, which is what made it so deadly.
Right.
But single shooter mass killings, way down. So
Right.
in 2000, or actually 2001, when GW came into office, he overturns that ban by executive order.
Yep.
All of a sudden now you can go out and you can, and again, full disclosure, right? Full disclosure. When the ban went off, I went out and I bought a shit ton of these high capacity magazines. Now
Yeah.
this is not, well, actually I am a bit of a hypocrite. Full disclosure, right?
Well,
But the point is, like, I have no need to carry. You know, you'll see these guys going into Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts with the AR-15 and in a shoulder sling over their back, and they got the big magazine, and then they got banana clips in their shorts, and I'm like, okay, what the fuck do you need that for? You know, are you compensating for something? You know, everybody likes to talk about BDE these days, right? You know, big dick energy, right? There's SDE too, right?
Yeah, a lot more of that actually.
And a lot
They,
more of that.
some of them drive big pickups around here, but anyway.
Yeah, yep. Big trucks, big guns.
Let let me just come back and say, I don't think it's fair to say that you're a hypocrite because you talked earlier about the ability to regulate yourself. So let me come back. Let me kind of reframe or try to reframe this a little bit. So when I got emotional a minute ago, that was also could be in a context hypocritical because I'm talking about how we don't reason and have conversations. We get emotional with one another, and I'm sticking both fingers in the air saying "fuck you." I'm
Yeah,
talking to the politicians who don't give a damn about the people at all. All they care about is who's filling their coffers. So
yeah.
that's where my emotion was directed. It was not specifically directed at this issue of gun control. But
Yeah.
here's why I'm saying this, Derrick. It was directed at our government that has become so corrupt. It's become Frankenstein's monster that has gotten out of the laboratory. But here's where I think most Americans agree, whether which side of the issue that you're on. I believe in a person's right to self-defense. That's
Yeah.
part that's built into life, liberty, and the pursuit of property or the pursuit of happiness, right?
Yep. Self-defense is part
You
of
have
self-governance.
the right to self-defense, and that self-defense may involve a gun, right?
Yep.
So I'm not saying that guns are bad. I'm not saying let's just ban guns altogether.
Nope.
I'm not saying any of those things. But here's the problem. You can't defend yourself. And this is where I'm going to come into your discussion about AR-15s. You cannot, or other types. I didn't even know they made a shotgun like that. I can't
Yeah,
even
buddy.
imagine, dude. My God, I had to just rip
I mean,
your
my
arm
shoulder
off.
was like hamburger for a month.
I bet it sounds fun and amazing, but
It
here's the
was.
issue. If we frame this about self-defense, how do you defend yourself? And see, this is why I'm so passionate on this issue. If we can all agree that guns are necessary for self-defense, and I don't have a problem with you owning a gun for the purpose of defending your home and your family and your property.
Yep.
But how do your children defend themselves in school against somebody who has a weapon and it's not being used for the purpose of self-defense? It's being used for the purpose of murdering your child. I'll tell you exactly how you do it. You have conversations like I've had to have with my kids that
Yeah.
you roll around in blood and play dead
Yeah.
if you can. You run and hide if you can. And I'm telling you that Uvalde thing, fuck those police officers. Fuck those fucking cowards
But
for
hey,
not
dude,
going
you know,
in.
you've already. This is something that this is one of the silent parts that doesn't get said out loud. Is that because it's Texas? You had teachers there that had guns.
Yeah, but
No,
yeah,
I'm saying, you know, like, yeah, I understand what
I
you're
know
saying.
what you're saying. I'm
Those
gonna
those cops were fucking cowards for not taking this on. That I get that part. But what I'm saying is that the conservative argument about the good guy with the gun
oh, it's bullshit.
is
It's
bullshit.
so total bullshit. Like I give the teachers a complete pass. I don't give those fucking police officers a single
Nope.
pass because I'm gonna tell you something that traumatized my children because they're like, Dad, what if we have a school shooting? Why should we even call 911? What if they won't even come in? And so I applaud every other law enforcement agency in America that's had to deal with this, where they have gone in and in that bank shooting, wasn't there an officer that lost their lives or something
Yep.
like that? Like I
There
applaud
was.
the people.
Well, actually, he
Who are,
didn't get killed. He got shot in the head, and he's expected to recover, but
um,
he's gonna have some serious shit he's got to go through.
so I applaud the ones that are out there doing the job and doing it the right way. I applaud them. I applaud them for their courage. The Uvalde Police Department, cowards. But let's come back to self-defense. You can't defend yourself against a mass shooter.
Right.
The teacher with the gun, I think about my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. McDonald. I don't want her carrying a 9mm in her purse. You know what I'm saying? Like if that's my hope, then all hope is lost. You know what I'm saying? But what if we reframe this and say, okay, the original intention, let's give I'll side with Scalia on this. All right. The original intention of the framers, I don't believe this at all, but let's just concede the argument. Their original intention was that you could have the right to keep and bear arms to defend yourself as an individual against a perpetrator. Fine. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But let's carry the self-defense argument forward then and say, how do we defend ourselves as a society? How do we exist as a society when we have created this monster of a thing where anybody can go buy massive, the banana clips, like you said, carry the AR-15 with banana clips shoved in their shorts, and then go out and just murder people. Where's the self-defense in that? That's where legislation is supposed to stand up and handle societal problems and handle societal issues. And the states can't even do it, because then all of a sudden now they're violating the Constitution. When they're not violating the Constitution, because people don't even understand the original intent of the Constitution. Which is why I think this is such an important conversation that you and I are having tonight.
Oh no, this is vital. And here's the thing, right? That nobody needs basically law enforcement. Your average M1A1 police officer that carries a sidearm, the weapon of choice is a Glock 17. Which in a standard configuration can hold 17 shots in its magazine. I don't think that there's any reason for anybody to have more than that.
Right.
And honestly, even in home defense, you have 17 shots. If you're not completely trained on how to handle this weapon, you're going to go out there, bang, 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 right? And you're going to ricochet shit. You're going to shoot shit you don't want to shoot. And possibly your family or your neighbors, right? Because most people really don't know. How much ammo do you need to defend your home? This isn't The Walking fucking Dead. It isn't like we're defending against the zombie apocalypse. This is like one guy, maybe two, maybe three, break into your house, right? And typically, because I know a couple of people that this has happened to, that typically once you hit one of them and they scream out in pain, the rest of them either flee or surrender. Nobody's trying to nobody wants a gunfight. Nobody wants a gunfight. And then when you start talking about going beyond your home, right? What you're saying is you don't necessarily want the right to defend yourself. You want the right to say any fucking thing that you want and be able to respond with violence if somebody punches you in the mouth they give you a well-deserved punch in the mouth for saying, that's the problem. And so going back to your point, talking about legislation, I think honestly that high capacity magazines should be outlawed. And I think that the weapons platforms that can receive high capacity magazines should be outlawed. You don't need that.
Well, I think in some ways the toothpaste's already out of the tube, right? Like the guns are already out there. So I think that the type of legislation that makes the most sense to me, and I don't know if anybody's talking about it, is on purchase of ammunition.
Yeah.
Maybe background checks, maybe red flag warnings when you go to purchase the ammunition, not just the gun.
Yep. Yeah.
because you have to cut off the supply at some point, and it's too late to cut off the supply on the gun end. You see what I'm saying? So why aren't more people talking about how do we regulate the sale and
Here, let
distribution
me
of
throw something in there on that one, right? Because Chris Rock said something that was just really profound on that. He said, "Make every bullet cost $500."
yeah,
And if you make every round expensive, because right now, like you can go out and buy 9mm ammo for as low as like probably about 40 cents a round.
yeah,
You know,
that's cheaper than an egg.
yeah. So if you can cycle that, that makes it, hobby worthy.
Hmm.
You go to the gun range and you just want to cycle through a couple of hundred rounds, you can do that. But if you make these rounds like, okay, let's just say make it simple. Like let's say $50 a round. Even police departments are going to think twice before they do that. And this is the other thing. I say that if you are a gun owner, right? Let's say you don't have to necessarily. Well, I'm trying to understand the conservative side of it because if you say, well, you got to register all your firearms, then you can say, well, the government can come and get them, right, and go door to door. That's their big fear, right? But let's just say that if you go to a gun shop and you want to purchase a firearm, then you have to show proof of insurance. That you have a certificate of financial responsibility saying that if anything goes sideways with this gun, hey, I got something that they can pay for it. Like if I have an accidental discharge of my weapon, or if I go out and shoot somebody, and I didn't really mean to, I just meant to scare them, okay, now you have some insurance. And the insurance, of course, would go up every time you have a claim, right? Just like car insurance. Simple, right? I don't understand why we can't do something like that
Yeah,
even.
yeah. I just saw Ben posted a comment. I want to speak to this because this touches my life personally because I'm a mental health counselor. And again, the pushback, you know, guns don't kill people, people with guns kill people or whatever. And so the burden then falls on mental health evaluations,
Hmm.
type stuff, right? So Ben
Yeah.
says psychological evaluations seem like a good idea in theory, but people know how to play the system. It's actually more complicated than that. And I'm going to speak to this because I just did one this week.
Mm.
And I can't say too much more than that.
Yeah.
But, I was asked by the powers that be, is this person safe? And I talked to him for an hour and I'm like, I have no idea. I said, I don't have enough information to make that decision one way or the other. Because here's the thing, two components to this. To get a full psychological evaluation and to get an accurate psychological evaluation takes about 2 full 8-hour days. And there's two reasons for that. People will lie to you, but they will also lie to themselves. Most people don't know why they do what they do, really, or how they're wired, or how to solve their own psychological problems. So to get an accurate psychological evaluation takes a PhD level psychologist whose sole job is not counseling people and it's not helping people. It's strictly administering batteries of tests to people and then knowing how to interpret them. Ben says that's not a slight on you, Aaron. No, I didn't take it that way, Ben. I want to clarify this issue for people because in the general populace, I'm seizing on that comment as an opportunity to clarify this issue for people. It's not that simple. You can't just go to any mental health clinician and talk to them and they can know your state of mind. That takes thorough psychological evaluation to rule out not only how you might be lying to me as the clinician, but how you might be lying to yourself. And so therefore not giving accurate answers. And there are batteries of tests to get to the bottom of that. But again, it takes a PhD level or a doctorate level person who their entire doctorate has been devoted to administering and interpreting psychological evaluations. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that if someone is truly a psychopath, which is a clinical condition, they know all the right things to say. In fact, a psychopath is more apt to get through 16 hours of psychological evaluation and not be accurately identified because they're so psychopathic they know how to fool the system. So this idea that mental health evaluations, and I'm not saying you're putting that forward, Ben, because you said, in theory, it's a good idea. I'm just saying this is a popular opinion that's been put out there that is absolutely and unequivocally, not only is it not a solution to the problem, but it's going to put a burden on the mental health provider community, which is already overtaxed and overburdened, and open us up to legal liabilities later on down the road. So thank you, Ben, for giving me the opportunity to speak to that part of this issue.
Yep. And I want to talk about this again, like the AR-15 thing, right? Because I think that one of the things that people do is they conflate weapon types, right?
Yep.
So they'll conflate an AR-15 with like an M16, which M16 is the military version of the AR-15, which shoots a 7.62 NATO round and not a 223, and it's also selective fire. In other words, you could with the flick of a switch, you can go from a single shot semi-automatic weapon like a AR-15 is to a fully automatic where you hold the trigger and fire until it's empty, right? And machine guns since the days of Al Capone are highly regulated. Again, you have to have a class 3 federal firearms license in order to have a machine gun. And on top of that, every single weapon that you have, it requires registration with the federal government. That gun, the purchase of that gun, the storage of that gun, all of that has to be tightly controlled. And because the federal government also reports back to the state is aware of these weapons, right? And so the AR-15 is not a machine gun. It's only deadly because it can hold a lot of ammunition. Now, there are modifications you can make to this. For one thing, if you go into your receiver and you disassemble the sear, which is basically what stops. It's a recoil stop that every time you fire requires another pull of the trigger. You can remachine the sear in such a way that it just completely goes. Now, that gets kind of dangerous for a gun that's not made for that, because M16 is made with a higher or a stronger metallic composition, or a stronger metal for the barrel and the receiver to handle the heat of 100 rounds a minute, 200 rounds a minute, right? An AR-15 doesn't have that. So basically, you could theoretically fuse some parts of your gun if you don't fully modify it. And then there's this thing they call them bump stops, right? And the bump stop is something that attaches to the butt of the rifle. It minimizes the recoil, and it does it in such a way that basically the bump stop causes you to pull the trigger automatically. So it's effectively like holding the trigger. You don't get the same cyclic rate as you would in a fully automatic weapon, but you're firing pretty quickly, which that's what the guy in the Las Vegas shooter was
Right.
using.
Right.
He had bump stops on his weapons, and so basically he had effectively fully automatic weapons. So there basically I would say things that modifications, and this is why I say weapons platforms that are easily modified. I
Mm-hmm.
think they should be tightly regulated. I think that they should have the same regulation as say machine guns,
Sure.
because that way you're not just going to go in and you're not going to be able to enact a generic mod that gets you to have the equivalent of fully automatic cyclic rate.
Right.
So those are some of the things that we can do. But this is the thing, and I want to say this, and I really want to say this emphatically. I mean, I can't emphasize this enough, that our elected officials are there ostensibly for our benefit. When the special interests command more attention, respect, and reaction from our elected officials than our children, that's a fucking problem. And this is the issue that I have. For all of you Christians out there, man, thoughts and prayers ain't cutting it, right? And then on top of that, if you call yourself a Christian, you need to divorce yourself from all of this pro-gun shit and pro-violence shit. If you're going to say that I am Christ or Christ in me, if you're going to say that, fucking live it. And this is and again, this is something where I've been very vocal about, that when it comes to like police killings of unarmed black people, the quote unquote body of Christ, if they simply just spoke up, they could end this in a week. It would stop. It would absolutely stop. Likewise, if these same Christians will speak up and say that, hey, I'm going to subordinate my political desires and place some demand on my elected officials to do something beyond thoughts and prayers about these people that are being killed. Now, and finally, I want to say this, that in all of these cases, virtually all of these mass shootings, the people who got these guns got them legally. There are very few black market guns or ghost guns that are used. I mean, the Nashville shooter bought all of their firepower within 7 days prior to the event. This guy in Louisville bought his gun 2 weeks before his shooting. It isn't, people will say, well, you're only fighting against the law-abiding people. It's the law-abiding people that are out here committing the fucking crimes. Mm-hmm. It's not the Crips and the Bloods. It's not MS-13. It's not these people. This isn't gangland violence. This is largely angry white people. Mm-hmm. And until we have a come to Jesus moment about this and say, we need to deal with issues like, I mean, for crying out loud, it should be easier for you to get counseling than it is for you to get a gun. Mm-hmm. Or if you can flip this around and you can say, okay, you guys say you're all pro-life and everything, and you want to make it hard for a woman to get an abortion. Make it at least as hard for someone to get a gun. Make it at least as hard to get a gun as it is to get an abortion. And you'll stop a lot of this shit. But we're going to have some intellectual honesty. Well, and to your point, Aaron, we're going to have some dialogue. I mean, and again, to all my liberal, socialists, and even atheist friends out here, the problem is the guns. I give you that. But at the same time, demonizing the right about this is not the answer. At some point, both sides are going to have to sit at a table and have some meaningful dialogue on this shit and come to some solutions, some realistic solutions, because this is unsustainable. I'm grateful that I no longer have school-age kids, but Aaron, you do. Mm-hmm. And you happen to be in Republican country, in Boebert country. Yeah. I have a genuine fear for your kids. Mm-hmm. And for everyone else that's living in a red state where, again, the legislators are willing to sacrifice your children on the altar of their guns.
But see, we can solve the school shooting problem without even addressing guns. We can. And I go back to 9/11. Like, how many other airplanes have been used as weapons to fly into buildings? Well, why is that? Because literally overnight, and regardless of what anybody thinks of George W. Bush, whatever,
Yeah,
and whatever his motives were, and whatever the whole 9/11 thing is, I don't know. I have no
yeah,
idea. But every airport in the world was transformed overnight. Their security was transformed virtually within a
yep,
month.
yep, exactly.
And every possible scenario was thought through to the point. I'll tell you a story, to the point that you have to take your shoes off still, because we had one like shoe bomber.
Yep,
But when my one of my kids was young, we flew into the DC airport. I can't remember the name right now, because that whiskey's kicking in, but
Dulles.
Dulles. It was Dulles, and we're
Okay.
flying out, and we had too much formula. Watch this. Watch this. We had too much formula because we were violating the 2 ounces or whatever you
Yep.
can take of liquids, right? So they pulled us aside, and I'm not shitting you at all when I say that they thought one of my kids was the diaper bomber, and they were literally feeling him up and molesting him right in front of us to make sure we hadn't hidden anything in his diaper. And because you know me, I contacted about as high up the security chain as I could at the Dulles airport. And I was told they watched the video and that the officers there followed policy and procedure. So we're able to secure our airports to the point that it's policy and procedure to be okay to molest your kid. Literally. I'm talking literally. I'm
Yeah.
not even, this is not hyperbole. Columbine, 1998, 1990 is in the late 90s. And here we are, 2023.
Yeah.
So schools get federal funding, you know. We have Homeland Security now.
Yeah.
Why can't you establish education security department?
But hang on. Let me say something about that, because see, this is something that frustrates me. Like when we went to Phoenix, when we moved to Phoenix, we were amazed at how all of the schools looked like prisons. And what we found out is that the construction company that was used in most of the West Valley was the same company that built the prison out there, the Louisville prison. So it's like, it basically the schools are there to condition kids to this prison like atmosphere.
Yeah, we need to do a whole episode on that.
Let's go back to when you and I were kids, and you're a few years younger than me. But when you were a kid, did you have cops in school?
Derrick, I grew up in the farming community, right? So you
Yeah,
remember those gun racks that
yeah, in the back of the pickup
that
trucks.
those good old boys,
Yeah, but oh yeah.
rednecks, crackers, whatever you want to call them. It was nothing to see several trucks with 2 or 3 rifles or shotguns in the school parking lot
Yeah,
on the racks.
yeah.
And I'm going to tell you right now, the idea that some maniac would just come in, or some disgruntled person or some angry person would just come in and shoot up our school, that could not have entered our minds. That could not have entered our minds.
But if you looked at the guns that were in those gun racks, you would see shotguns, you would see,
Yep.
22 long rifles, you might see a 30-06, right? In,
All of
in
the
other
above.
words, they were legitimate hunting rifles,
Yeah.
legitimate, business rifles, not the kind of hardware that these people are using now. And that's so. Like the other thing too is that they were talking about in what matter of fact, in some parts of the in the Phoenix area, the schools have metal detectors. In Detroit, the high schools have metal detectors. You can't come into school with, and I'm like, why does it have to be that way? If we just simply said, okay, anything that can be converted into a 100-round killing machine, let's just get rid of that. And watch this. You could stop the manufacture of them, and you say, well, the ones that are out there are out there. But when Bill Clinton and his administration outlawed the high capacity magazines in 1994, mass shootings went way down, and they stayed down
Yeah.
until after 2000, or with the
Yeah.
exception of 99 and Columbine.
Yeah.
So it's, you can make a legislative difference. There are things that can be done. My thing is, what pisses me off is that, we as a society, our politicians, our leaders don't have the balls to stand up to this and say, hey, enough is enough.
Hmm.
You know, I'm listen, I'm one of these people. I will not say that I'm in favor of coming in and the government taking away your
I'm not
guns.
either. I'm not
I'm
either.
not that guy. I believe in personal liberty. And I do believe that if you can be responsible enough to have a gun, that's just like if you drive a car and you've demonstrated a propensity to driving drunk, they will take your license and take your car.
Hmm.
And I think that that's perfectly valid. And as
Mm.
a matter of fact, right, so if you were to compare, like, say, high capacity magazines to,
Hmm.
like, say, high performance cars, there's a reason, like the Corvette Z06, which is the most badass Corvette that you can buy, right? You cannot buy that car right now for under $200,000. There's a reason for that, right? Because everybody doesn't need to be in a car that can do 200 fucking miles an hour.
Right.
A Bugatti Chiron can do 300 miles an hour.
Right.
300. But it costs $3 million.
Right.
Like, and the people that can afford this, they're not going to go out and abuse this because they want to be able to keep the thing that they worked so hard or whatever, to get their money, right? So, I mean, there are lots of different things. Like for example, you know, you have to get certification in order to do hair and nails.
Yeah.
You have to have certifications to own a dry cleaning service. You have to have certifications in order to practice medicine or nursing. You have to have certifications and licensing in order to fucking handle the dead. Why can't we have some certifications and regulations around weapons? I don't think that that's a heavy lift. If you can qualify for the licensing, if you can qualify for the insurance, if you can afford to pay that and all of that, then hey, no problem.
Hmm.
But then at that point, we know what's out there, we know who has it, and everything. There's some traceability, which leads to accountability, which right now we have none, and
Yep.
that's my issue. You know, Going back to what we said start at the beginning, the Second Amendment. You know, a well-regulated militia without that context, and then the context of the second clause. If you take that away and just leave the third, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, then what we're doing now is we're just basically saying, hey, whatever,
Yeah.
whatever.
So last thing I'm going to throw in here, because you bring up something that I've thought about a lot, um, in terms of like home defense, like what makes sense, right? So for me, a handgun does not make any sense for me. For
Yeah,
me,
yeah,
because I'm not that accurate with a handgun. Um, and I also understand the fight or flight response that's going to happen if I ever have to use one. And we always refer to it as a fight or flight response, but it's actually fight, flight, or freeze.
Yep.
And from your military training, you had to go through, I mean, for how many hours you were out doing whatever it is you did, Derrick? How many hours of training were behind that? Because you couldn't afford to freeze up on the battlefield, right?
Nope.
And so who knows how I'd react. So this is why this is so stupid. The good guy with the gun argument is so incredibly stupid. This is why I don't want Mrs. McDonald defending me with her, 9mm or 40 caliber pistol or whatever she's got in her purse, right? Because
Yeah.
you don't have the training for it. Even in a fight, right? Like everybody thinks they're gonna, like, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the mouth. Well, if you're facing a gun shooter, if you're facing an active shooter, you've been hit in the mouth.
Yep.
And so, what makes sense for me, honestly, is a shotgun as far as home defense, because I've got a better chance, I figure, if God forbid. But even, a semi-automatic weapon, like you said, I mean, okay, so I can get a bigger spray, but still I have to move it. If I'm perfectly still and I'm just firing it, even if it's fully automatic, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So you don't need, like, I don't think a handgun does a damn thing for most people in terms of self-defense. I don't think,
Not unless you're good.
yeah. And so, what choices does that leave you? You're certainly not going to get out your hunting rifle.
Yep.
And so this whole idea of self-defense, let's be practical about it. And this whole idea of, well, let teachers carry, like, okay, so how often are they at the shooting range? What are they carrying? Are they carrying
Well, wait a second. What if a teacher has a bad day? What if a student is disobedient? What if, there are all kinds of
right?
things.
It's
Then the
so
teacher
stupid.
becomes the shooter.
It's so incredibly stupid. It's such a bullshit argument. And the fact that that's become the trope, dude, it's disheartening.
Well, let me say this, right? For those of you who are in the home defense, let me tell you something. I have 3 rounds in every shotgun I have. 3 rounds. The first round are rubber balls, high density rubber balls. They're not lethal, but they hurt like a motherfucker when they hit you. I know I've been hit by them. They hurt, right? The second shot is rock salt, right?
Mm.
Now, rock salt is going to penetrate the skin and that salt's going to burn and that's going to really get your attention. I don't care if you're strung out on crack, if you're strung out on meth, a little rock salt in your ass, I have your full attention at that point. Now, at that point, it really stops. Now, the third load is double R buck. That's man killer, right? But in most cases, if you use these 3 loads in your shotgun, you're never going to get to round 3.
Yeah.
It's like round 1, you've got you let them know you mean business. Round 2, you let them know you're going to hurt them, and at that point, they're like, "Fuck it, I'm done."
Yeah. So a similar strategy, right? Like birdshot, buckshot, and a slug.
Yeah, that too,
Three
that
rounds.
works too.
But yeah,
That works too.
absolutely. All
And
right, bro.
one more thing
Yeah.
for people that are listening, there's a type of ammunition. It's hard to get. It's called Glazer ammunition, and it's called the surgeon's nightmare, right?
Mm.
Because what it does is it fragments badly on impact, right?
Ooh.
And if you want to get if you insist on using a handgun, get some Glazer ammo, because the beautiful thing about Glazer is that it can't penetrate drywall.
Mm.
So you won't mess around and shoot your kids by accident or shoot your dog or anything like that.
Well,
So
Derrick, thank you for sharing such a wealth of knowledge about firearms. I loved having this discussion with you because, um, you know, I don't know. I hope people will watch this, and I hope the dialogue is helpful. I hope people learn something. I hope they're able to think. Um, and at the end of the day, I don't know, man. I don't know. We've got to come together on this as people. That's the only strength we have is if we can come together. And the problem is that we've let both sides divide us so much and activate that limbic brain, like I was talking about earlier, that we have no real voting power. I think most people agree. You got go back to what's the window called?
The Overton window.
Yeah, go back to the Overton window. I think most people are in the common sense, right there in
Yep.
the middle. But we don't talk about it because we made it absolute on both sides. Just like you said, your liberal friends, socialist friend, atheist friends, like you aren't going to move the needle at all if you're all the way over to the let's just take away everybody's guns. Like, good luck with that. Good
That's
luck
not
with
the
that.
answer.
And as far as everybody on the far right, like I saw Ben commented earlier, where we've got Congress people, including one in my district, that send out Christmas cards every year with their family and their AR-15s or whatever they are, their semi-automatic rifles, like their toys that are being handed out at Christmas, is abhorrent to me. But most people aren't to the far left or the far right. But at the end of the day, we've got to figure out a way to come to a consensus on this issue so that we can start punishing politicians in the ballot box if
Yep.
they don't start addressing this, because at the end of the day, they're being rewarded by the NRA, they're being rewarded by the gun companies, and until enough of us can come together and punish them at the ballot box, nothing's going to change.
Well, the NRA moved out of New York because they're trying to avoid a potentially bankrupting lawsuit, right? And I honestly think that you don't need an organization like the NRA to codify your gun rights, and more to the point, I think that we need to remember that the Constitution is intended to be a living and fluid document,
Yeah.
that there's a process for amending the Constitution. And I think that if we look at this realistically, we can say, okay, there is no need for a well-regulated militia that is not part of the standing military, because the National Guard ultimately, while it is under the control of the governor of each state, it can be mobilized for the defense of the nation, and that has happened. We've seen lots of guardsmen and guardswomen go overseas and fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've seen it happen. So there's a precedent for that. So there is no well-regulated militia. We could simply say that there is going to be reasonable legislation around gun ownership, however that's framed, and put that to the states for ratification as an amendment to the Constitution. Bingo. And then we solve this problem. We get rid of the NRA. We get rid of all of the right wing propaganda. And then the other thing too. And again, those of you who are Christians, I urge you to really look at this through the lens of the guy you call your Lord and Savior. Because if you do, you're going
Yeah.
to find that none of this gun shit makes sense. It,
True.
it, it, it doesn't line up with what with what you believe. And if you do that, then what you do is you effectively break the link between the right wing ideologues and the gun lobby. And once that's broken, you will absolutely neuter the gun lobby.
Yes. Yep. That's what needs
So
to happen. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening, watching, commenting.
yep. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you like and subscribe, click the bell so that you get the notifications, and and share this with somebody. If there was something that Aaron or I said today, please share it. And it's not because either one of us are super cool, or which we are, or that anything that we say is like super profound, which it is. But just share it because it's good shit. Okay. So, Aaron, take it away as you normally do.
Thanks for coming to our TED Talk, everybody. Namaste, peace and hair grease. And you can make a difference. You really can.
That's it.